Patrice Lumumba was the first Prime Minister of the Republic of the Congo to be democratically elected. He was a Congolese independence leader who founded the mainstream Congolese National Movement (MNC) party and played a pivotal role in Congo's struggle for independence from Belgium. Before becoming active in politics, he had been a writer and political organizer. A committed nationalist, Lumumba called for Congo's independence from Belgium and became a leading figure in the country's independence movement. In June 1960, Patrice Lumumba became the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Congo. Nevertheless, his premiership did not last long, and his political career came to an abrupt end when he was killed in 1961. Lumumba was said to have been poorly buried in an unmarked grave, then exhumed and finally dismembered, with pieces of his body dissolved in sulfuric acid while the bones were crushed and scattered. Soon after the independence of the Congo and the rise of Lumumba as Prime Minister in 1960, a revolt broke out in the army that marked the beginning of the Congo crisis. Lumumba appealed to the United Nations and the United States to help put an end to the Belgian-backed Katangan rebels led by Moise Tshombe. They both declined, however, so the Prime Minister turned to the Soviet Union for assistance. This appeal led to increasing disagreements with Joseph Kasavubu, the president, and Joseph Désiré Mobutu, his chief of staff. Lumumba's contemporaries described him as an elegant dresser and versatile dancer, brilliant and articulate, and no one could compete with him for national leadership, as there was only one famous winner in the 1960 elections. Patrice Lumumba became Congo's first prime minister just as Belgium, the colonial ruler of the region, was preparing to grant her independence on June 30th, 1960. While being the country's #1 leader is one thing, exercising power and authority is another thing entirely. Without the protection of the armed forces of the country, Lumumba's power was on paper. His political authority as many crumpled ballot papers ready for incineration. The inability of the Prime Minister to deal with the military mutiny that began in July 1960, together with Belgium's scheme of promoting the secession of Katanga because of its rich minerals, marked the beginning of its end. Lumumba then went on to dance with the villains of that period, the Soviet Union, inviting Nikita Khrushchev to send military forces to put down another uprising in his country after the United Nations and the United States had rejected his appeal. Still in pain over Fidel Castro's invasion of Cuba, the West would never forgive him for his friendship with Moscow. They saw him as a Marxist instead of a Pan-African nationalist. Therefore, the process of the political removal of Lumumba began, primarily involving the United States and Belgium, to get rid of the first Prime Minister of Congo. With the outbreak of the Cold War, it was inevitable that the United States and its Western allies would not be prepared to let Africans have effective control over strategic raw materials, lest these fall into the hands of their enemies in the Soviet camp. It is in this regard that Patrice Lumumba's determination to achieve genuine independence and to have full control over Congo's resources in order to utilize them to improve the living conditions of Congolese was perceived as a threat to Western interests. To fight him, the US and Belgium used all the tools and resources at their disposal, including the United Nations Secretariat, under Dag Hammarskjöld and Ralph Bunche, to buy the support of Lumumba's Congolese rivals and hired killers. In Congo, Lumumba's assassination is rightly viewed as the country's original sin. Coming less than 7 months after independence, on June 30, 1960. It was a stumbling block to the ideals of national unity, economic independence, and Pan-African solidarity that Lumumba had championed, as well as a shattering blow to the hopes of millions of Congolese for freedom and material prosperity. The assassination took place at a time when the country had fallen under 4 separate governments: the central government in Kinshasa, then Leopoldville; a rival central government by Lumumba's followers in Kisangani, then Stanleyville; and the secessionist regimes in the mineral-rich provinces of Katanga and South Kasai. Since Lumumba's physical elimination had removed what the West saw as the major threat to their interests in the Congo, internationally led efforts were undertaken to restore the authority of the moderate and pro-Western regime in Kinshasa over the entire country. These resulted in the ending of the Lumumbist regime in Kisangani in August 1961, the secession of South Kasai in September 1962, and the Katanga secession in January 1963. Declassified documents reveal that the CIA had plotted to assassinate Lumumba. These documents indicate that the Congolese leaders who killed Lumumba, including Mobutu Sese Seko and Joseph Kasavubu, received money and weapons directly from the CIA. This same disclosure showed that, at that time, the US government believed that Lumumba was a communist and feared him because of the Cold War. In the end, Lumumba's Congolese rivals, assisted by Washington and Brussels, put him under house arrest and beat him almost to death before eventually flying across the country to the secessionist Katanga on January 17, 1961, where he was exiled to a secluded place and disfigured by gunshots from the local gendarmerie. Lumumba was poorly buried in an unmarked grave, then exhumed and finally dismembered, with pieces of his body dissolved in sulfuric acid, while the bones were crushed and scattered. The Belgian man responsible for Patrice Lumumba's death took out 2 of his teeth and covered them with gold as souvenirs. In 2013, the US State Department admitted that President David Eisenhower had authorized the murder of Lumumba as the inauguration of President-elect John F. Kennedy in January 1961 caused fear among Mobutu's faction and within the CIA that the incoming administration would shift its favor to the imprisoned Lumumba. While awaiting his presidential inauguration, Kennedy had come to believe that Lumumba should be released from custody, though not be allowed to return to power. However, Lumumba was killed on January 17th, 3 days before Kennedy's inauguration on January 20th, 1961. Interestingly, Kennedy would not be aware of Lumumba's gruesome death until February 13th, 1961. At a time of rising hope for an African independence period, what happened to Lumumba during his tenure is still a matter of concern, particularly in Pan-African relations. Unfortunately, even to date, those responsible for the death of Lumumba are yet to be charged. Nevertheless, Lumumba was a man of strong character who had the intention of pursuing his policies, irrespective of the enemies he had made in his country or abroad. Furthermore, the Congo was a key area in Africa's geopolitics, and because of its wealth, scale, and proximity to white-dominated southern Africa, the opponents of Lumumba had reason to fear the effects of a democratic or moderate Congo government. The government's justification for his demise was immediately disputed, although it would take decades for the full circumstances surrounding his assassination to be made public. Lumumba's death caused a storm across Africa and beyond. Retrospectively, even his critics called him a national hero. Nevertheless, 5 years after his brutal assassination in 1966, Patrice Lumumba's image was rehabilitated by the Mobutu regime, and he was proclaimed a national hero and martyr in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. By a presidential decree, the Brouwer's house, the site of Lumumba's brutal torture on the night of his murder, became a place of pilgrimage in the Congo. In 2002, Belgium formally apologized for its role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. On June 30th, 2018, a Lumumba Square was inaugurated in Brussels, Belgium. The square is situated at the entrance of the Matonge neighborhood and was inaugurated 58 years after the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 1964, Malcolm X, an American human rights activist, declared Patrice Lumumba the greatest black man who ever walked the African continent.